There are moments in history when humanity stood at the edge of extinction, moments when logic whispered surrender and fear screamed retreat, yet something unseen moved behind the silence. What if I told you one of the greatest miracles ever recorded didn't begin with power, but with weakness? What if deliverance didn't come when people were strong, but when they had absolutely nothing left? Imagine standing barefoot on burning sand, shackled not only by chains but by hopelessness, knowing tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday, until suddenly, impossibility cracked open and God stepped in. The story of Exodus does not begin with miracles. It begins with suffering so deep that even hope learned to stay quiet. Israel was not a nation of warriors. They were slaves crushed under the weight of an empire that fed on their exhaustion. Egypt was the most advanced civilization on earth, its monuments scraping the heavens, its gods carved in stone, its armies unmatched. Pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was worshipped as divine. And yet, behind the brilliance of palaces and pyramids, an entire people cried out in the darkness, their prayers echoing off brick walls built with their own bleeding hands. And here is the uncomfortable question: why does God so often allow his people to reach the very edge before acting? Could it be that deliverance shines brightest when human strength disappears? Israel didn't cry out because they were brave, they cried because they were broken. And that cry, soaked in tears and desperation, rose higher than Egypt's gods ever could. Then comes a baby, hidden in a basket, floating on a river that was once used to drown his people's sons. Isn't it strange how God uses the very instrument of death to carry the seed of deliverance? Moses was raised in the palace of the enemy, educated by the very system that enslaved his people. Yet when he tried to save Israel in his own strength, he failed spectacularly. One mistake, one rash decision, and the prince of Egypt became a fugitive in the desert. 40 years passed. Silence. Dust. Forgotten dreams. And that is where many people quit, when God seems absent, when destiny feels delayed, when life settles into disappointment. But God often does his deepest work in obscurity. While Moses tended sheep on the backside of nowhere, heaven was preparing a confrontation that would shake the world. And then, without warning, a bush burned without being consumed. Fire appeared, but destruction didn't follow. Isn't that the pattern of God's presence? Power without loss, fire without ruin, holiness without annihilation. God did not introduce himself with comfort, he introduced himself with authority. I am. Not a title. Not an explanation. Existence itself speaking. Moses argued. He doubted. He feared. He stuttered. And yet God didn't withdraw his calling. If God only used confident people, history would be empty. Deliverance does not wait for perfect faith, it responds to surrendered obedience. When Moses returned to Egypt, it wasn't as a prince, it was as a messenger. No army. No weapon. Just a staff and the name of the living God. What followed was not just a battle between Moses and Pharaoh, it was a cosmic showdown between false gods and the Creator himself. Each plague wasn't random punishment, it was targeted exposure. The Nile, worshipped as life, turned to blood. The sun god was mocked by darkness. Livestock gods fell dead. And yet Pharaoh's heart hardened. Why? Because power without humility always resists surrender. And here is a shocking truth: Sometimes God allows resistance so His glory can be undeniable. The longer Pharaoh refused, the clearer it became that this was not coincidence. This was confrontation. When the final plague came, it wasn't chaos, it was precision. God made a distinction between Egypt and Israel. A lamb's blood on doorposts became the difference between life and death. Deliverance didn't come through strength, but through obedience and faith in what God said would protect them. And then, finally, chains broke. Generations of slavery ended in one night. Israel walked out not as fugitives, but as a redeemed people. But freedom's greatest test doesn't come at the exit, it comes at the edge of the impossible. Pharaoh changed his mind. The most powerful army on earth thundered toward a nation of former slaves trapped between an unyielding sea and advancing death. And that's where many of us are right now. Trapped. No way forward. No way back. Fear behind us. Impossibility in front of us. And the question presses heavy, did God bring us this far just to let us die? But watch carefully. God didn't remove the sea before Israel arrived. He waited until fear was unavoidable. Because when the path opens where none existed, there is no doubt who did it. Moses raised his staff. The wind roared all night. And by morning, the sea obeyed its maker. Walls of water stood like witnesses as Israel walked through on dry ground. Not running. Not crawling. Walking. Deliverance wasn't rushed, it was deliberate. And when the enemy followed, the same path of salvation became the instrument of judgment. The sea collapsed. The impossible swallowed oppression. What chased Israel for generations was erased in a moment. Not by swords. Not by strategy. But by God Himself. Yet here's the most surprising truth of Exodus: freedom happened quickly, but transformation took time. People can leave Egypt in a night, but Egypt doesn't leave the heart so easily. The wilderness revealed something deeper than chains, it revealed trust issues. Even after miracles, people complained. Even after deliverance, they doubted. Isn't that unsettlingly human? And yet, God didn't abandon them. He fed them. Guided them. Stayed with them. Because deliverance isn't just about rescue, it's about relationship. Exodus is not merely a story of escape, it's a story of covenant. A God who doesn't just break chains but walks with His people through uncertainty. So let me ask you, what sea is in front of you right now? What impossible situation feels like the end? What fear is chasing you from behind? If God can turn oceans into highways, what makes you think your situation is beyond Him? And maybe this story moved something deep inside you. Maybe it reminded you that you're not forgotten. Maybe it gave you hope when logic said give up. If that's true, don't keep it to yourself. There are people drowning in fear who need this reminder. Someone scrolling in silence, praying for a sign, waiting for deliverance. When you like this video, you push hope into someone else's reach. When you share it, you become part of the miracle. And when you subscribe, you declare that stories of faith, truth, and deliverance still matter in a world starving for light. Because miracles don't end with Exodus. They continue wherever someone chooses to believe that impossible is exactly where God begins. The journey did not end at the sea, in many ways, it only began there. Because once the sound of crashing waves faded and the dust of the wilderness settled on their feet, the people realized something unsettling: freedom feels unfamiliar when all you have ever known is captivity. The silence after deliverance can be louder than chains. No whips cracked behind them anymore, yet fear still echoed inside. And isn't that the hardest part of faith, learning to live free when your mind still remembers slavery? The wilderness stretched endlessly, a vast landscape where comfort was scarce and certainty even scarcer. Days grew hot, nights grew cold, and questions grew heavier. Why did God bring them here? Was this barren land really better than full stomachs in Egypt? Hunger has a way of rewriting memories, turning oppression into nostalgia and bondage into safety. People began to murmur, then complain, then accuse. It's shocking how quickly miracles fade when expectations rise. Yesterday's sea-splitting wonder was no longer enough for today's empty stomachs. But God did not panic at their doubt. He responded with provision that defied logic once again. Bread fell from heaven with the morning dew, delicate and mysterious, enough for each day but never enough to hoard. Dependence was the lesson. Trust was the curriculum. And when thirst threatened their lives, water flowed from solid rock, as if creation itself bent in obedience to the one who spoke it into being. Isn't it strange how God often places abundance inside what looks lifeless, teaching us that sources don't define Him? Still, hearts wavered. Even surrounded by miracles, people fashioned a golden idol from their own wealth, choosing something visible over someone faithful. It's uncomfortable to admit, but humanity hasn't changed much. We still trade the unseen God for tangible substitutes when waiting feels too long. Yet instead of abandoning them, God revealed something deeper: His desire to dwell among them. A tabernacle, crafted with care and beauty, rose in the wilderness, a moving sanctuary where heaven touched earth. The God who shattered Egypt's power chose to live among fragile, inconsistent people. Exodus whispers a truth we often overlook: deliverance is not just an event, it's a process. God doesn't merely pull us out of danger. He reshapes who we are on the journey forward. Every step in the desert exposed what slavery hid. Fear, impatience, pride, and doubt surfaced, not to destroy Israel, but to transform them. And though they stumbled, God remained present, guiding them by cloud and fire, close enough to follow, powerful enough to trust. And here's the profound mystery: Exodus is not only Israel's story. It's humanity's reflection. Egypt represents everything that enslaves, everything that promises life but steals freedom. Pharaoh is the voice that says you'll never change, never escape, never be enough. And the sea stands as the moment of decision. The impossible place where faith either dies or rises. Every generation faces its own exodus. Different landscapes, same choice. Trust the God who delivers, or return to familiar chains. Perhaps that's why this story still shakes hearts centuries later. Because deep down, we recognize ourselves in it. We know the exhaustion of waiting. We know the fear of stepping into the unknown. We know what it's like to cry out, wondering if anyone hears. And the answer of Exodus echoes across time: yes, He hears. Yes, He remembers. Yes, He acts. Not always on our timeline, not always how we expect, but always with purpose greater than we can see. And maybe right now, you're in your own wilderness. Maybe the miracle you prayed for hasn't happened yet. Maybe you're between promise and fulfillment, wondering if freedom was just an illusion. If that's you, hear this quietly but clearly: God does not waste deserts. The place that feels empty is often where identity is forged. The delay is not denial. The silence is not absence. The same God who parted seas still moves in unseen ways. So don't scroll away thinking this is just an ancient tale. This is an invitation. An invitation to trust again. To hope again. To believe that what looks impossible is simply unfinished. And if this story stirred something within you, if it reminded you that you are not alone in your struggle, then let it move beyond your screen. Like this, not out of habit, but as a declaration that faith still matters. Share it because someone you know is standing at their own sea, desperate for courage. Subscribe not for content, but for connection, to stories that lift weary hearts and point broken spirits toward deliverance. Because Exodus teaches us this final truth: chains break, seas open, deserts end, but the God who delivers remains forever. And if He did it then, He can do it now. In the modern world, Exodus speaks with a voice that feels uncomfortably current. We no longer build pyramids or crack whips, yet slavery has simply changed its clothing. Today it looks like anxiety that never sleeps, debt that tightens quietly, addiction that promises relief but demands loyalty, systems that profit from exhaustion, and voices that tell people their worth is measured only by productivity. Egypt still exists, not as a place on a map, but as a mindset that convinces us captivity is normal and freedom is risky. Exodus reminds us that just because something is familiar doesn't mean it is good, and just because something is powerful doesn't mean it is permanent. One of the deepest lessons for the modern world is that oppression often becomes invisible over time. The Israelites didn't wake up one day as slaves; it happened gradually, generation after generation, until bondage felt like identity. In the same way, modern people slowly accept lives overloaded with pressure, comparison, and constant noise, calling it just how life is. Exodus confronts that lie. It declares that God hears cries people have learned to whisper and sees burdens society has learned to ignore. Freedom begins the moment we recognize that what drains our soul is not what we were created for. Another lesson is the danger of mistaking power for permanence. Egypt looked invincible. Its economy was strong, its military feared, its culture admired. Yet in a matter of moments, it was exposed as fragile before God. The modern world worships systems, technology, influence, and control, assuming they will last forever. Exodus humbles that confidence. It teaches that anything built without justice, humility, and truth eventually collapses, no matter how impressive it looks. True security is never found in systems, it is found in alignment with God's purpose. Exodus also challenges the modern obsession with speed. We live in a world that demands instant results, quick fixes, and immediate answers. Yet God delayed deliverance for generations, then shaped His people slowly through a wilderness. The lesson is uncomfortable but essential: transformation takes time. Freedom without character leads back to bondage. In a culture desperate to escape pain, Exodus teaches that some struggles are not punishments but preparations, shaping resilience, trust, and identity that comfort alone could never produce. Perhaps the most confronting message for today is how quickly people romanticize the past when the present feels uncertain. When Israel grew hungry, they remembered Egypt as a place of comfort, forgetting the chains. Modern life does the same. People return to toxic habits, destructive relationships, and harmful environments simply because they are familiar. Exodus warns us that longing for what once enslaved us is a sign of fear, not wisdom. Growth always feels risky at first, but returning to bondage is far more dangerous. Exodus also speaks powerfully to leadership in the modern world. Moses was not chosen because he was confident, articulate, or powerful. He was chosen because he was willing. This confronts a culture that glorifies charisma over character and visibility over obedience. Real leadership is not about dominance but dependence on God. It is not about personal greatness but faithful surrender. The world doesn't need more pharaohs, it needs more leaders who listen before they speak and serve before they command. At its heart, Exodus teaches that freedom is not merely the absence of chains but the presence of God. Modern society often defines freedom as doing whatever we want, whenever we want. Exodus offers a deeper definition: freedom is living in alignment with who we were created to be. That's why the story doesn't end at escape but continues into relationship, guidance, and purpose. Liberation without direction leads to confusion. Deliverance without connection leads to emptiness. And maybe the most hopeful lesson for today is this: impossible moments are not evidence of abandonment, but invitations to trust. The sea did not open until there was no other option. In the modern world, where control is prized above all else, Exodus invites us to release the illusion that we must manage everything ourselves. Some breakthroughs only come when we admit we cannot save ourselves. So when the world feels overwhelming, unjust, or unchangeable, Exodus still whispers the same truth it always has: systems rise and fall, fear shouts loudly, and hope often looks foolish, until God moves. And when He does, what once seemed impossible becomes the very stage on which deliverance is revealed. What we learn from this story is not just history, but a mirror held up to our own lives. Exodus teaches us that suffering does not mean God is absent. For generations, Israel cried out while nothing seemed to change, yet those prayers were never ignored. In the same way, delays in our lives are not signs of abandonment. Sometimes God is preparing a deliverance so complete that it cannot be mistaken for coincidence. Silence does not mean inactivity, and waiting does not mean defeat. We learn that freedom often begins where human strength ends. Israel was delivered not when they were powerful, organized, or ready, but when they were exhausted, trapped, and outmatched. This shatters the modern belief that we must have everything figured out before change can happen. Exodus shows that God specializes in moments when options run out. The sea only parted when there was nowhere else to go, teaching us that impossible situations are not dead ends, but doorways. The story also teaches us that familiarity is not the same as safety. Egypt was known, predictable, and structured, yet it was deadly to the soul. Freedom felt uncertain, uncomfortable, and risky. Many people remain bound today not because they lack opportunity, but because they fear the unknown. Exodus warns us that staying in what is familiar but destructive will always cost more than stepping into uncertainty with faith. Another lesson is that transformation takes longer than escape. Leaving Egypt took a night, but unlearning slavery took years. Exodus reveals that God is not only interested in rescuing us from external problems, but in healing what captivity did to our hearts. Complaining, fear, and doubt surfaced in the wilderness not to condemn the people, but to expose what needed to change. Growth is often uncomfortable because it requires letting go of old mindsets. We also learn that provision flows from trust, not control. Manna could not be stored, only received daily. This directly challenges a world obsessed with security and accumulation. Exodus teaches dependence, learning to trust God one day at a time. It reminds us that anxiety often comes from trying to control what was never meant to be carried alone. The story shows us the danger of misplaced worship. When waiting felt unbearable, the people turned to a golden idol they could see and touch. This reflects a timeless human tendency to replace faith with substitutes when patience runs thin. Exodus teaches that visible idols cannot replace an invisible but faithful God. What we trust most will eventually shape who we become. We learn that leadership is about obedience, not perfection. Moses doubted himself, struggled with fear, and made mistakes, yet God still used him. This offers hope to anyone who feels unqualified or broken. God does not wait for flawless people, He works through willing hearts. Most importantly, Exodus teaches that freedom is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of God. The wilderness was difficult, yet God was closer than ever. Fire by night, cloud by day, provision in scarcity, His presence redefined what security truly meant. Real freedom is knowing that even when life is uncertain, you are not alone. In the end, Exodus teaches us that the same God who delivered then is still at work now. Chains may look different, seas may take new forms, but deliverance still begins the same way, with trust, obedience, and the courage to step forward even when the path is not yet visible. So as this story comes to rest, it leaves us with more than memories of miracles, it leaves us with a decision. Exodus reminds us that no chain is too heavy, no system too powerful, and no situation too far gone for God to redeem. What once looked like the end became the beginning, and what felt like defeat became the doorway to deliverance. The same God who heard the cries of slaves still hears the silent prayers of weary hearts today. If you are standing in your own in-between place, caught between what once held you and what you cannot yet see, remember this: the sea did not open before they stepped forward. Faith moved first. Courage followed. Deliverance came last. And sometimes, the miracle you're waiting for is waiting on you to take that next step. If this story stirred hope inside you, don't let it end here. Let it move through you and beyond you. There are countless people scrolling in silence, burdened by fear, searching for reassurance that God still makes a way where none seems possible. When you like this video, you help push light into someone else's darkness. When you share it, you become part of another person's breakthrough. And when you subscribe, you choose to stay connected to messages that remind us faith still has power, hope still has purpose, and deliverance is still real. Carry this story with you. Walk forward even when the path is unclear. Trust even when the night feels long. Because the God of Exodus is not a God of the past, He is the God who still opens seas, still breaks chains, and still leads His people into freedom. And now, as the story fades into silence, let it settle in your heart. Exodus is not just about a people who walked out of slavery, it is about every soul who has ever whispered a prayer through tears and wondered if God was listening. It is about the nights when fear feels louder than faith and the future feels locked behind walls you cannot climb. Yet this story declares something unshakable. Even when you feel forgotten, you are seen. Even when you feel stuck, God is already moving. If you are tired, truly tired, carrying burdens no one else sees, this story is for you. The God who parted the sea did not do it because the people were strong, but because they were desperate enough to trust Him. That means your weakness is not a disqualification, it is the very place where God's power is invited in. The tears you've cried, the prayers you thought went unanswered, the moments you nearly gave up, none of them were wasted. Every step through the darkness has been leading you closer to freedom. Maybe right now you're standing at your own edge, with fear behind you and the impossible in front of you. Hear this gently, you are not trapped. The sea may look unmovable, but it has not yet met your God. And when He moves, what stands in your way will become the path beneath your feet. You don't have to see the whole road, you only have to take the next step. If this message reached your heart, don't let it stop with you. Someone you love is silently drowning, praying for a sign that God still cares. Be that sign. Like this video as a quiet declaration of faith. Share it as an act of love. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to hope, to truth, to stories that remind broken hearts they are not alone. Because the same God who turned impossibility into deliverance then, is still doing it now. And if He carried them through the sea, He will carry you through this too.